Dr. Sanders went to the University of Florida as an undergraduate, and he was the co-valedictorian there. He received his MA and PhD from the University of Pittsburgh. Before coming to Utah State, Dr. Sanders taught at SMU and also at Brooklyn College. He has received numerous awards and recognitions. For example, his article, Citizens of a Free People, Popular Politics, Race, and Class in 19th-Century Southwestern Colombia, won the James Alexander Prize for the best article of 2004 in the Hispanic American Historical Review, which is pretty much the top journal in Latin American history. His book, Contentious Republicans, which you see here, which many of you have read, although it wasn't a complete prerequisite for you others who have not read it to come here. It was published by Duke University Press. It explores how indigenous groups, ex-slaves, and small farmers created a democratic politics in 19th century Colombia. His next book will examine how Latin Americans imagined and practiced a Republican Atlantic world community in the 19th century. Dr. Sanders is fluent in Spanish and also does well in Portuguese, I understand. His most recent language is Goo Goo Gaga, which he has learned from his newly born daughter, Chloe, who could not be with us today. I have some interesting connections with Dr. Sanders. First of all, he sat next to my mother on a flight from Salt Lake City to Las Vegas for a conference a couple of years ago. So he knows my mom probably better than knows her better than any person he's ever sat next to on a plane, probably. My cousin is a master's student at Utah State University and has had him in a class, and she assures me that besides being a great scholar, Dr. Sanders is an excellent teacher. And so we are fortunate to have him here today, and let's give him a hand.
Well, thank you for that really kind introduction. What I would like to, and Katie, by the way, is teaching at Weber State next fall, so she's already, reaching our level. What I'd like to do today is talk a little bit about the main arguments that are in the book, but I'm not going to spend a whole lot of time doing that since many of you have read the book, and I saw the quiz you took, which was quite mean. And so I'm not going to spend a whole lot of time, but since some of you have it, I'm going to introduce the book that way. Talk a little bit about how, what we do, what Professor Shulman and I do for a living, how this book was made, if that has a little bit of interest, and then open it up for questions, and I'll have some for y'all as well. And if we have time, I might talk about my next project, but we probably won't have time. So first of all, the first thing, at least I think about when writing, when reading another professor's book is why they wrote this. And of course, as a graduate student, when you're looking for your project that you're going to work on, you're trying to find a reason to write a book. Why do this? Why spend all this effort to produce this? And in general, the big problem I was trying to figure out was the ways in which and why popular groups participated in politics in the 19th century. That's the big thing I was trying to do in the book. And I thought that would be something interesting to do because of things I'd read in other books that I'd read as a graduate student about the nature of the 19th century in Latin America. And again, the general consensus up until sort of the mid-90s, of about a decade ago, was that most popular groups, by popular I mean not members of the educated upper class or even the middle class, most popular groups really played no role in politics. And just a quote from sort of the dean of Columbianist, David Bushnell: "The political framework directly touched the lives and affairs of only a small minority of the population." So this is only that wealthy minority that care about politics. The rest, it doesn't affect them. Up until this point, mostly in the 19th century, people assumed that popular actors were either indifferent to national politics, they didn't care about it, they were ignorant of it, they didn't know about it, or if they did, they were hostile toward it. The national idea, being Colombian, the national state in Bogota, that's something that you're actually going to be hostile towards. It's something that's going to interfere in your life in some way that you're not interested in. That was sort of the standard, what historians call the master narrative. That was the standard story. And so, but I began to suspect that probably wasn't the case. And again, it wasn't just that I was doing this. This was part of a broader movement of historians, and I was influenced by other historians, particularly a book about Mexico, looking at popular actors there. And first of all, I thought, well, I'm just going to do that for Colombia. You have this graduate student moment. That's what I'm going to do. That's going to be the answer to all my problems. I'm going to do this for Colombia. What this other scholar did for Mexico, showing the levels of participation of popular groups in national politics. And so, well, how would my book be different than this other book? Well, first of all, no one's Colombia. It's of all the Latin American countries, it's the fourth, I think, largest population-wise after Mexico, Brazil, and Argentina and Colombia usually are right there with each other in population. Has one of the larger gross national products. Yet historians, by and large, don't write a lot of books about Colombia, and so nothing like this had been done in Colombia. And I was going to ask all of you, why do you think that might be? Why, compared at least to, say, Brazil or Mexico or even Cuba, a much smaller country, or Peru, or Argentina or Chile, why are there so many less books on Colombia? Does anyone have any thoughts why that might be? Yes. Yeah, that's a big part of it, is that people in the U.S., in the U.S. Academy, tend to study places where the U.S. has had some interest and role. So where the U.S. has either been intervening a lot, so Cuba, there's your example there, or where they've been investing a lot, where at least U.S. money has gone. And Colombia, for a variety of reasons, nothing to do with my book, hasn't received a lot of U.S. investment until recently, let's say. And so now, again, eventually there is pretty significant U.S. intervention in Colombia. Of course, Panama's broken off with significant U.S. interest to form its own country, but compared to other parts of the 19th century, it hasn't been. And certainly investment-wise, there's been very little in Colombia, and some scholars argue that Scott follows investment. Why else might scholars not be studying Colombia? And that's one very good reason. Why else might that be? Okay, imagine that. Yes. Yeah, imagine that you tell your mom and dad that oh yeah, I'm going to go down and live in Colombia for a year. They're not going to be all that happy about that. It is perceived as a dangerous place to work. It's actually not that dangerous, especially as a historian, where you're sitting, and I'll show you where I was sitting in an archive. I mean, it's once you're in the archive, you're not any more danger than if you're over in the Lee Library here, let's say. And so once you're there, you're there. But there is a sense that it is more dangerous. And so people have been sort of turned away by that. And it is harder to get money to go there because they're afraid if an agency gives you money and you're kidnapped by the FARC, that somehow they're going to become responsible. They're going to get a call saying, we need $10 million to let this gringo historian go. And so they don't want that to happen. So there's less reasons for that as well. And finally, and this is a more academic reason, is that Colombia is a little weird. Colombia doesn't follow the big historiographic trends of much of the rest of Latin America. For instance, Colombia's never had a serious sort of military dictatorship like happened so much in Latin America in the 50s, 60s, and 70s into the 80s. Colombia's a little different, and so it doesn't fit historiographic models as easily. So for all those reasons, I thought, well, I'll do Colombia because I was really interested in it, and no one else really does it. And that's one of the great things in general. I'm going to make a pitch for Latin American history because I know most of you are history majors, I assume, and some of you may be thinking about going on to study history professionally. And one of the great things about Latin America in general, okay, help. Oh, there we go. Okay, is that compared to the U.S. history, it's generally there's very little done. If you go to WorldCat, which I'm sure most of you have used, this big catalog of all the libraries, or many of the libraries in the world, and type in U.S. Civil War, you get somewhere along the line of 99,000 books and articles, this is WorldCat, on the U.S. Civil War. If you go and type in Colombia Civil War, and Colombia had actually a lot of civil wars, as you read in the book, then you get 179. And so there's just a lot less done, which to me is exciting. For instance, if you pick just a general, not particularly exciting U.S. president, let's say Grover Cleveland, which was the search. Yes, he served 2 terms. That was the only thing interesting. I mean, if you had to say something about Grover Cleveland, that's what you say. Well, he served 2 non-consecutive terms. There are 2 independent Simpsons references that a friend of mine came up with to Grover Cleveland, but that's beyond the point. So this fairly unimportant U.S. president. There's 334 books about, entries, 194 books about them. If you type in Tomás Mosquera, who we're going to come back to later in the talk, and you recognize from the book, he was president of Colombia 3 times, not just 2 times, not consecutively. He's president of Colombia 3 times. The probably most important president in the 19th century, for Colombia. And yet, if you type in his name, you get 54 books, only 4 of which are in English. Most of those 54 books are actually his own writing, so he wrote a lot about himself. So you have 4 books in English. And so it's just a little more, I find it a little more exciting to be able to study areas where it hasn't just been completely overdone. Now, of course, for those of you studying U.S. history, it's not really what happened. We tend to know what happened by now, with some exceptions. And there's some things that people didn't know that I found. Really what historians do is figure out why it happened. That's what keeps us in business. Because of what happened, we sort of know. But why it happened is open to continuous debate. Well, why did this happen? And so for the Colombian case, we knew that there were these civil wars, and we knew subalterns fought in them, but we didn't know why. That had never really been explored why. So I thought I was doing 2 new things, both a new why and also a new what, because there was a lot of things that just weren't even known about 19th century Colombia. No one had done the research yet, and I'm going to talk a little bit more about that. So so why do poor Afro-Colombians, poor Indians, these Antioqueño migrants, why do they vote in elections? Why do they fight in civil wars? What's in it for them? What are they doing there? All right, so that's what I thought that I'd be doing, and I picked Colombia as well because it was one of the few regions in Latin America where you had a distinct group of indigenous people, people of African descent, and a group of sort of self-identified Antioqueños, this group of self-identified as white, coming into a region. Again, most of you know from Latin America, if you tend to have either indigenous populations or African populations, you don't tend to have both. As a general rule, but this area has all 3. So I thought I could compare their visions of politics, and I didn't think that had been done before either. There have been some books on popular liberals that have been done in Latin America, but there have been no books on popular conservatives. And of course, you have to have both. I mean, if in these civil wars, someone's fighting on both sides, and no one had really looked at popular conservatives yet. And so I thought that would be something interesting I could do as well. All right, so, and that's, of course, what I found is that, these different groups in Colombia had distinct visions of politics, whether it was the groups I call popular smallholder Republicans, the Antioqueños who were coming down onto the frontier, into this region of the frontier here and settling this area that hadn't been settled before in the colonial period, how in their way of talking about politics, they really stressed liberty, the liberty of the individual farmer coming down, with his family and starting a new life, and the political rights that would come from that, of hardworking, padres de familia, heads of families, and then also the popular liberals, mostly of African descent here around the city of Cali and also along the coast here, again, who's mostly just equality. Not surprising, being that they were slaves or had been slaves or their ancestors had been slaves, stressing in their political discourse the equality that should exist between all people in a republican system. And then finally a group of what I call popular indigenous conservatisms, Indians mostly in this region here around Popayán and Pasto, in this area, who stress fraternity, who stress how that they believe communities have a responsibility to one another, and that their political goal is to protect those communities, to make them viable in a new system that may be hostile toward these communities, that may see them as a throwback to the colonial period. So that's what I began to find. And so I noticed that fairly early on in the research, as I began to read petitions these groups had sent into the national government. But then I wanted to answer, well, why? Why do they have these views? And I can only do that by looking at the social history of each group, to figure out why they talk about politics the way they did. So that to look at the ways that they live, I thought would answer that question. So I wanted to look at whether they own land or not, what their villages were like, who they worked for, or were they independent, And so there were those economic relations I wanted to try to establish. Did they work on a hacienda? Did they own land communally? Did they own land as individual farmers? I also wanted to look at social and cultural relations the groups had, the gender relations within their communities, how men and women interacted, the racial relations between the groups. What did the Antioquinos think about these Afro-Colcanos in this region, or the Indians in that region? What do they think about them? And then also their cultural values. Particularly the role of the Catholic Church in the different communities becomes very important here in these different communities. And then that would lead me to answer these bigger national questions about politics, how these local politics interacted with sort of national political authority. And in doing this, I realized that the way Colombian history had been written in the 19th century, which was basically a story of elite families and how they sort of formed factions with each other, or came to hate each other or like each other. That was a story of politics. Basically elites, factions. Why some became liberals, some became conservatives, how they switched over time. That was the story. That would tell you what you needed to know about politics in the 19th century. Well, what I argue in the book is that you really can't understand 19th century Colombian politics without looking at how these factions of liberals and conservatives make alliances with popular groups. And in the period of the book, the Liberal Party is pretty dominant, and they're dominant because they form this very tight alliance with Afro-Colombians, with people of African descent, by and large, who they manumit, they end slavery, and they sort of gain their loyalty, and at least for a period of time, those are their voters, those are their soldiers in civil wars, and long as these two groups are together, they really can't be beaten by the conservatives. By the end of the book, of course, we'll talk later on, eventually conservatives figure out a way to overcome this, and that liberal alliance falls apart. And so now this is not just a story of wealthy families and what side they're on, even though that's still very important. You have to really look at popular groups to make sense of this as well. So that's one thing that I wanted to look at. The other thing that I found as I did the research, and I hope my book could comment on, was that I was hoping that this story might say something about the history of democracy in the world. Because if you read, I think, still textbooks today, sort of your high school textbooks, where is modern democracy born? Where does it happen? Where does modern democracy come about? The U.S. The U.S. and where else? So was that England, France, maybe French Revolution, U.S. and Europe? That's where it happens. That's where democratic innovation happens, and the rest of the world sort of is going to try to follow and catch up and imitate that in some way. I think that's still pretty much the dominant argument. Not even. I mean, I think that would be the argument maybe in most political science classrooms, at least at Utah State. I don't know about your political science department, at least in ours. I argue with those guys all the time. And so that's their argument. What I found is that if you look at 19th century Colombia, it's very democratic. One of the easiest ways to measure democracy is through voting rights. It's not the best way to argue, but it's the easiest. And by 1853, all adult males, regardless of property or literacy or race, could vote in Colombia. There's very few places in the world that can say that. Most of those that can say that are in Latin America. The U.S. certainly can't say that in 1853, where, of course, people are restricted on their voting by race. People of African descent and Indians are not allowed to vote. And even in a number of areas, there's still some property requirements that are still hanging on. Most of those have been eliminated in the age of Jackson. But there's still a couple areas where those are still sort of hung around, in those areas. In Europe, it's even worse. In Europe, the voting restrictions almost always still have property requirements, by 1853 that are pretty limiting. And so, if you're looking at the history of democratic innovation, extending the suffrage in this case to a wide variety of people, and of course one big group's left out, which is of course who's left out? Women. They're still left out, but they're left out all over the world this time. So you look at the history of democratic innovation, Colombia, is a leader actually. And if we want to make a history of world democracy, we have to take what's going on there seriously. We can't just ignore it and say, well, it's not happening in Europe, it's not happening in the U.S. Well, I'm going to argue, it is important. Now, as we'll talk about later on in the question and answer period, maybe, eventually this democracy is somewhat undone. And so maybe that helps explain why people don't think about this today, because it's not, eventually, that doesn't go on into the future. Eventually, it's sort of rolled back. So that might explain that as well. And so, one of the quotes I open a chapter with is by one of the presidents, Manuel Mayorino, who states in one of his quotes that Colombia, if not as prosperous as other countries whose existence measures centuries, referring to England and France at this point, is without a doubt as free as any in the old and new world. So yes, we're not as prosperous as Europe, but if we look at political freedoms, we have just as many, if not more, than any place in Europe or in the Americas as well. And I think before I did the research, I would have thought, oh, this is just some politician, that's the politicians say, oh, yeah, we're the best, we're wonderful. But then when I actually did it, no, we have to take this seriously, actually. We have to take this seriously. And so that's another thing I was trying to do in the research as well. Now, there's lots of small arguments I won't go into today in the book. I'm a bit. It's better to have a book about one thing. I think there's a lot of little smaller arguments that I probably shouldn't have put in there. But why does slavery end in Colombia? Why do the indigenous peoples of this region here, why do they maintain their land holdings, and they still do today? And in most other parts of Colombia, this part over here, this blank, they lost that land. Why is that? Questions such as those. There's a lot of smaller things that's going on in the book. We'll talk about those in a bit. I'll see what questions you have about that. So those are the big arguments of the book, and we'll talk in the question and answer period about the other really large argument. Why does this end? Why does this fall apart? If you're interested in that. And so I briefly laid this out. Before we get to the question and answer period, I would like to talk briefly about, if you're interested in how this was made, how you go out doing a book like this, in case some of you plan to become professional historians yourselves. And of course, I talked about the first part, finding a topic already. How you find a topic, and this was by reading other books, in consultation with my advisor, who did also work on Colombia. But eventually, of course, you have what you think is going to be a topic, and I had and what I thought I was going to do, what I did for the book at all. But you have what you think you're going to do, then you go down and do the research. I think not many people go to Colombia. And this is one of the archives that I worked in, actually the best archive I worked in, the Archivo Central del Cauca in Popayan. And it's in a wonderful colonial building, and you see this is the courtyard, and these are the books sort of piled up around there. It's not organized at all. It's basically, the organization is chronological. You ask for a year, say 1863. They bring you a big stack of paper about this big, tied with cord, and they undo it on your desk, and all the paper falls off because the cord's been eating into the side of the paper. All the paper falls off on your desk, and they let you look at these 100-year-old documents. And there's a big stack, and there's not particularly any particular order. And then you sort of go through and look for what you're interested in. For those of you who are sociologists, political scientists, you'll be horrified by at least my historical method, which is flipping the pages very quickly and hoping something catches my eye. Historians tell stories. I'm a humanist. Some historians are social scientists. I'm a humanist, and so I'm telling a story. It's not a scientific method. I wish there was some scientific method to do that, but I couldn't figure it out. So again, you political scientists, I'm sure, are horrified. Like, that's not how you do research, but that's how I did the research. And so, and there's several, because there's 3 or 4 of these stacks per year that you would go through. And of course, reading the book, what do you think my better source was for understanding how these groups thought about politics? What's the source that I probably, again, probably you weren't looking at the footnotes so much, but what do you think it was? Petitions. Again, not something historians have used a lot, because most historians have thought petitions, these don't really reflect who wrote them. They reflect the ideology or not who they represent. They reflect the ideology of who wrote them, which was probably some lawyer outsider who wrote these things. And if that were the case, then all petitions should look alike. And what I found was that they look very different between the group that wrote them. So there must be something there. Something more than just, this is just some lawyer in Popayan, saying what the governor wants to hear or something. And so that was one of my best sources were, again, these petitions. Again, this is in a bound, but this is from the Congressional Archive in Bogota. This one's actually bound up in a book form. You can't see that very well. I'll get a closer view. This is one of those a bound book looks like. Here's what a petition might look like. This is a petition from Afro-Colombians, from some ex-slaves on a hacienda near Quilcase. They're written to the municipal government, and that's just the start of the petition, saying we the undersigned residents of this village are claiming our rights. And here's the signatures. What do you think these little things are?
They all look like the same hand.
They're all of the same hand. So what's all this stuff then? Their mark. Most of these people cannot read and write, so someone signs for them, and then you make your mark to say, yes, this is that I'm acknowledging this is my signature. Here's an obvious X, but most people actually have a mark which is a little more complicated, which is their own mark, just like your own signature is supposed to be different. And so that's what some of these petitions look like. Here's the signature of an indigenous petition. And again, in indigenous villages, probably someone could read or write usually in the village. And you'll see some look a little different, like they actually signed their own name. And you notice that they're identified by who they are: the governor of Potosi, the governor of Mayaguez. But most again, would not be able to sign their own name. So again, would make their mark. Again, literacy is fairly limited at this time period in Colombia. At this moment. So petitions are one of the best ways of going about this. But there are a lot of other things as well. Government reports, newspapers, books written by academics of the time period who were sort of studying the region. Mostly good for getting the action these groups took. Not so much for their ideas, because they're probably misrepresented, by these other people, but the actions they take, which is just as important as ideas. Something I try to do in the book is mix, how people talk about politics with what they actually do on the ground. Now, the other side of the story, though, of course, is that I'm trying not to study these popular groups. And again, here's just another page of those signatures. I'm trying to not study popular groups just in isolation. To understand what they're doing, I have to understand what their wealthy allies are doing. The leaders of these liberal conservative parties are doing. And so, how do I get to what they're talking about? They're actually easier because they wrote more, they kept records, they founded libraries. And so I began to look at their private letters. And also, one of the joys of working in 19th century Colombia is trying to decipher 19th century handwriting, which is incredibly messy. And so these are some of the things you have to try to figure out what this guy is saying there. He begins, mi muy querido amigo, después de algunas noches de molestias y angustias, and it goes on and on. And so this is you pick it up after a while. And but when you get someone with nice handwriting, you really do appreciate it. And then, of course, if you get newspapers, that's even nicer because then it's printed. And so you can go through those very quickly. 19th century newspapers, at least in Colombia, don't carry what we would call the news. They don't have events of the day represented. They're really more essays about politics and about your opinions of politics. That's what's going to be in these newspapers. More than sort of this is what happened at the municipal council meeting last night. No one cares about that. It's more diatribes and essays about politics. So this is about your political legitimacy and what it means, and why Tomás Mosquera, that president, talked about why he's not legitimate. So that's the kind of thing you get. So it's great for political discourse. They're actually not so good for figuring out what happened on the ground. Then you need to go to government archives and everything to figure that out. And one of the best sources is this guy right here, Tomás Mosquera. He kept a copy of every letter that he received. Not unfortunately that he wrote. He didn't keep a copybook, but every letter he received throughout his life. He received 66,000 letters in his life that he saved, and we have access to now. It's just a wonderful resource for what's going on in the country, because he had friends all over the country that wrote to him, as well as his family locally. So it's just a wonderful resource for historians to use. It's also why I like studying the 19th century, because by the 20th century, you don't tend to get things like this. All these, his family donated all these letters to that archive that I showed you before, the beautiful colonial building. They keep these letters nice and inside because it's valuable stuff. And now a powerful family probably wouldn't, in Colombia at least, donate their personal letters to a public archive. And why might that be? And this was donated early in the 20th century. His family donated this. Why, if you're a wealthy family now in Colombia, a powerful family, you have all these personal records, why would you probably not give them to, say, the National Archive?
Just like Freedom of Information Act in the United States, you're worried that something's going to get out.
Yeah, something's going to get out. That's going to get out. It's going to hurt you. When this guy sends on the letters, history is still very much an elite enterprise. They're not really worried that some historians are going to write something nasty about the family. The family did some, things maybe they wouldn't be so proud of. They're the largest slave owners in the area, for instance. And you're not really, historians are going to be respectful toward this family. But now historians probably are less respectful to things like that, and they might say some nasty things about you. And so probably you're going to keep those letters for yourself now, which is why 19th century history is so much more fun to do, because we have these personal items. The problem we're having now is that how do you communicate with your family now? Email. Do you save all that email? No. Most of it goes in your delete box. And so historians of the future are going to have a big problem, is we're not going to have all these letters written by, and family letters are great, resource for telling all kinds of things, not just about politics, about family interaction, about the social history of the day, and we're losing that, to a great degree. Today. Anyway, but we have those for 19th century Colombia, and they're a lot of fun. Again, so just to sort of sum up, and I'll open up for questions. This is another private letter, and just showing the difference between finding something new and new interpretations. And when I found this letter, I thought I had my smoking gun. This is a letter written by a priest, but a liberal priest, which was somewhat rare, in Popayan to the liberal president of that time period. And what he says in the letter is I'll just translate it into English. The complete extinction of slavery is sort of the obra magna, the huge work, the most important work that we need to devote ourselves to. 27,000 men weigh something in the electoral balance. And here's my smoking gun, where slavery didn't end just because some people eventually decided slavery was something wrong with it, and they decided to end it. It was a political bargain. We're going to end slavery, and then they're going to vote for us. And I thought, sure, no one had seen this letter before. They said, it's great. I have this in my hands. No one had looked at it since it was written, because surely historians would have noted this. Later on, I'm reading an essay by another historian, and he cites this letter, not that phrase. He cites it just saying, well, at this time there were probably about 27,000 slaves in Colombia. He uses that to get a number of slavery, but he ignored all the rest of it. Again, because at the time, that wasn't interesting to him. That's why historians, it's why. That's the question we're trying to answer. He was trying to answer, well, how many slaves are there? And so he found the answer. I was trying to answer, why do ex-slaves support the liberals? But here's the answer I used. So even when I thought I was finding something completely new, it's always the interpretation that's more interesting than just the newness of the document itself. So after I spent about a year and 2 or 3 months in Colombia doing research, I came back with I think I have the number here, 1,236 single-space type pages of notes. So it's about like that. And then I had to turn it into this. So it's all about the choices you make. What do you throw out and what do you put in? Obviously, 90% of the things I found never make it into the final product. All right, that's sort of how the book was made. I'd really like to open it up, since so many of you have spent some time with the book, which I do appreciate. I'd like to open it up and ask any questions you have about the book, and then I might ask some questions to you. Right, still writing. I came back from Colombia, and the first thing I had to do was that I had to actually figure out what I had there. Again, 1,200 pages of notes. I had to index them. I spent 3 months just rereading my notes and making an index so I could find stuff. And what I found is that I had read the same document in like a couple of places where there had been like a copy of it in 2 places, and of course since I read one in August and read one in March of the next year, I didn't remember it. That didn't happen too much because most places there's no copies of these documents. There's just one original. And so I spent about 3 months indexing and started writing. It took about 3 years of writing. Now teaching at this time as well, some of the time period. So I was doing some other things as well, but mostly writing. And then another couple years, sort of going. That was the dissertation. This was my dissertation, and that was the dissertation to finish that. Then another couple years turning that into a book, revising it, editing it, trying to make the writing better, adding the latest scholarship, rethinking my ideas along those lines. So all in all, I think I began research in 1997, and the book came out in 2004. So it was about an 8-year process in total, for it to be done. For historians, I think that's a reasonable amount of time, I guess. It does take a while. Any other questions? Yes.
How did you kind of find your interest in Colombia? What attracted you to Colombia?
Yeah, well, I think that the biggest thing was I really liked the idea of doing something where no one had done before. But when I started, I wrote my senior thesis at the University of Florida on Cuba, actually, and using archives that got deposited there after the revolution, the old 19th-century Cuba. And I always thought I wanted to do that. But the problem is that you can't really go to Cuba for a long period of time. The U.S. government doesn't want you to go to Cuba at all. And the Cuban government actually doesn't want you to go for very long. They want you to come down for a few weeks and spend some money and everything, but they don't want you to stay there because they don't think you're CIA or something like that. And I really wanted to spend a long time in the country. Nothing else for language. I'm not particularly strong with languages. And so I thought that if I'm really going to do this at a professional level, I want to really spend a year in Colombia, not only doing research, but really sort of trying to perfect my Spanish. And so I said I wasn't going to do Cuba. Then I thought I'd still do Mexico. But what struck me about Colombia was, again, this idea I had. I'm going to look at popular liberals and popular conservatives. And I was looking around the map of Latin America. Well, where might this happen? And then sort of Colombia struck me as a place. And then I just went down to investigate. I had a grant to go down to see what it was like. And I fell in love with Colombia. Colombia is just a beautiful country. It's a wonderful place to travel, actually. You have to take some precautions, not to run into the guerrilla. But other than that, you're fine. And then as I was talking with Jeff earlier, the archives in Colombia are fantastic. They're really amazing as an untapped resource, and so that's what I really, what really made me interested in it. But also, I'm a bit of a dilettante. As much as I love Colombia, my next book's not going to be about Colombia. Also, I like going to different places. So now I'm working in Uruguay a bit, and I'll be working back in Mexico and in Colombia for the next book. The next book's comparative, and so partly it's just good places I've never been. Yes.
Were you able to talk with the people in about your views
Oh.
in the book, and how was that like?
Oh, sure.
Did they agree with you? Or?
By and large, they did. Professional historians did not, because again, that same vision I laid out of the 19th century being dominated by elite families and popular groups were just sort of, abused. If they fought, they were just made to fight. Someone stuck a gun to them and said, "You'll go fight for us now." That was still the dominant idea. So they're all incredibly generous and nice. To this, to this clueless gringo who comes down and is like, can't find the archive and everything. So they're all very nice to me. But they always thought what I was doing was a little well, good luck with that, And so it wasn't really being done that much in Colombia, which again is not criticizing Colombian historiography. Colombian historiography has its own concerns. One of the biggest concerns is regionalism, which I wasn't so interested in. But it's a driving passion of Colombia, like trying to understand how Colombia, with all these different regions, is a country, is a nation. And so very friendly, gave me a lot of help, had a lot of discussions, but by and large, weren't quite buying what I had to say because no one had done this research yet. Now the book, hopefully, is being translated into Spanish, not by me. I'm working with a press in Colombia now, and I'll be curious to see the reaction. I've got the reaction of some people because I sent it to friends that I made there, and some of them read English, and they've generally been positive about it. So, yes.
Did you ever struggle while you were writing it as to who your audience was?
Oh,
How to deliver this information?
of course, it's very difficult because well, it's a library history book, so the audience is tiny to begin with. But there are even competing academic audiences because you could just write the book just for sort of other professors. And I tried to write it so students could read it and hopefully access it as well. But also I wrote it for Colombians. I wrote it for people hoping it'll be translated one day. But it is really hard balancing that audience. Especially using academic jargon, which you've probably encountered in my book a little bit, in other books you've read, using words that have no normal English meaning. One of the things you do if you go to graduate school is you learn another language. I don't know about Spanish or Portuguese or French. You learn academic language, which you're probably learning already in as undergraduates as well. You learn this very curious way academics talk and write, but which normal people don't talk and write, and there's a good reason for that because it's not a particularly good way to communicate. And so that's the struggle. I don't think I succeeded, by the way. I think it's something I struggle with throughout writing it, is balancing these multiple audiences. It's something very hard to do. And I certainly, this is not the best example of that. I mean, I can think of a lot better examples of historians who've done a lot better job than I have about that. Yes?
You had said that your topic changed when you got there and started doing the research. Are you happy with how it turned out?
I am generally happy with how it turned out. Not to say there's not some big weaknesses in the book, which some which I sort of I knew going in. And that's the question I'd like to ask. I'll say this is the last question, but I'll ask it now because we're running out of time. What do y'all think are some of if you were saying here's things that I wish this book would have done, or here's some real problems I spotted with this book, and don't be shy. Yes.
I'll say something again, just because I didn't really know much about Colombia, and I thought it was great. I thought I understood it really well. The first chapter I had a little hard time with.
The first chapter is that's the academic chapter. That's the chapter where it says this is where I say here's the big theoretical issues I'm interested in for other academics. Here's why you should care about this book. See, other academics don't care about Colombia. It's like Colombia, who cares? It's not about France. Then I don't have to do that if I was writing about France. But in Colombia, I have to do that. So the first chapter I realized was a little rough.
But after that, I understood it really well, and I felt like I knew Colombia better than other countries that I had studied. So.
Well, thank you. That's very kind. But now, let's get to some weaknesses now.
So we.
Yeah, I focus on a regional, and that's one of the weaknesses that could be of the book, is that this is a regional study. Now my publisher said, well, let's leave off that. Just say Colombia. Don't say 19th century Calico. Let's say Colombia because we'll sell few more copies. But and the reason I had to do that is because I simply just couldn't do the whole country.
So how did Colombia actually avoid having dictators?
Later on, I think Colombia, Now, again, for the 19th century, before myself and some other even Colombian scholars started working on this, the assumption was that these guys who were presidents were caudillos. They got their support not because people really believed what they stood for, but because of a personal interaction. You're going to vote for me because when the crops failed, I gave you a few chickens to get by, and that's why you're going to vote for me. Or because I got you, if you're middle class, I got you a job in the government. That was a standard interaction. Of course, that was happening. But what I found is that they actually had programs as well, such as ending slavery, protecting indigenous land holdings, defending the Catholic Church, or trying to limit the influence of the Catholic Church to actually attract the people as well. Now, why Colombia voted dictatorship in the 20th century, that's another question. I think, and this is not dealt with in the book, I don't remember that part. I think it has something to do with the fact that Colombia does have this somewhat of this democratic tradition where that could be somewhat avoided. But there's a lot of also sort of reasons in the 20th century as well why that happened that were more just about the 20th century. There was another question back over here. Yes.
You said stuff that consider weakness in your book. I like the book. Kind kind of gave everything away in the first chapter. Like you kind of
Yeah.
you explained everything about the different peoples and why they contended, and it's like, oh, that's nice. And then the rest of the book was kind of just
Yeah.
history synopsis.
Yeah, we have to lay out, the the arguments you're going to make, to begin with. That's sort of standard academic style. I was thinking about something a little more substantive, and that is, my argument is that, well, politics really changed around mid-century when I'm starting this book. Politics really changed from something different. If I really wanted to prove that a little better than I did, how would I do that? Excuse me? If I first had 19th century, more than the 5 or 10 pages I give to it now. Your professor has written a book that covers from 1770 to 1876, I believe, or 1776 to 1870, one of the two. A nice kind of historian's like a nice 100-year gap. Then he can actually show change over time. I'm having to use some secondary resources earlier to try to show how things change. But it would have been stronger. Again, why didn't I do that? Trying to find things like these petitions, you need a very limited time period to do it in. And plus, I knew my publisher would only give me 200 pages to tell the story, which you appreciate, I'm sure. I want the book to be 300 pages long. I'm sure you're very happy it was 200 pages long. And so, if I would have had those pages, someone asked, well, are you happy with the book? If I knew I could have written a longer book, and again, my publisher would not let me write a longer book, then I probably would have done some of that and pushed it back a little earlier into time. Again, if I didn't want to go to other places in Latin America, that probably would have been my next book. I'll do the first half of the century now and see what's going on there. But since I wanted to go to Uruguay, then I changed my next project. So, yes.
I also focus a lot on the popular liberals, like the Afro-Americanos, compared.
Mm-hmm.
Like it seemed that the indigenous and the smaller were sort of like marginal or like sort of incidental to the popular, like the black population.
Well, in one sense, they are in that since liberals are dominating politically, we have a little more information from them because they control government, so they control the archives. So we have more stuff going on for them. But because of that, also, their allies were more important at this time period, is sort of the argument I'm making. Because they have this tighter alliance. We see that happening toward the end of the book with the Antioqueños, the smallholders, how they form an alliance with the independent liberals. And they're able to then form an alliance with conservatives to take over the government and to kick out the older liberals. And so, but because they're in power, popular liberals actually play a greater role. Eventually, indigenous communities are able to actually sort of retreat from politics and saying, listen, now that we've sort of been allies with the conservatives, you have to take us seriously. And if you don't support us, if you mess with us, try to take our lands away, we're going to support one party or the other, but we're not really going to get involved otherwise. And so that's sort of their story. Yes, are we running out of time?
Just another question.
Uh-huh.
Right at the end of the book, you caught my eye. I think it was the second to last paragraph. You said that U.S. and Colombian current policymakers haven't learned from the past mistakes. My question for you is, what can they learn from the past?
Yeah. What can they learn from the past? Well, that was one of the questions I was going to ask you if we ran out of time. Is what do I mean by democracy in this book? I threw that word out a lot. What do I mean by that? Do I just mean elections? And, the answer is obviously I know. It means people participating in their government, having a stake in their government. I think that leads to the greatest stability over time. There's an assumption, if you read the justifications behind sort of U.S. and current Colombian policy, there's not a difference actually between the two, is that Colombia doesn't have a history of democracy. Is that's lacking in Colombia, so we have to sort of put that in there somehow. And the only argument I make, again, I'm not a policymaker, is that Colombia actually has this rich history, and that if you want to support democracy, you have to support democratic institutions. And so, the U.S. was pouring literally millions, going up eventually into the billions of dollars, into the military in Colombia. That's probably not the best bet if you want to encourage democracy. The military is not a democratic institution by its nature. I mean, they would say that. That's not what we do. We fight, wars. That's our job. If you want to do this, you should support these local democratic institutions which do exist in Colombia. That'd probably be the smarter thing to do. If that's your goal. So that's the point that I was just trying to make there. Jeff.
I'm sure students got it 2 or 3 times in the book. You mentioned that we cannot access the mindset of popular liberals, and I'm wondering, and I think to a degree that's true, but I also think that there are creative ways, perhaps, that it could be done. What do you think are ways maybe that you didn't have time to or couldn't do? Is there popular culture? Is there songs? Is
Yeah.
there poetry that perhaps we could
Yeah.
access a little more of this?
Well, yeah, to get, what I'm always careful saying that I'm doing, I'm talking about the ways people talk about politics. I'm not saying what they believe in their heart of hearts back in their home, that night, because I think it's really hard to access that. I think in Colombia, I think it'd be very difficult. I think you have to, if you're going to do it, historians that do it through things like folklore, through songs, through stories. They also tend to do something I'm in comfort with, which they use 20th century anthropology to reflect back on the past. And that's so tempting because, anthropologists go, to this little village here in the Colombian, Chocó, where the Afro-Colombians still live, and ask them about their history and their stories and everything, and they get these wonderful things that you can never do with the archive. But as a historian, I know how much things change over time. I know how this history of democracy has been forgotten in Colombia. So I'm sort of wary of using that to a large degree. That is one of the best ways to do it. It's one of the ways where you do get these visions. But I tend to think it reflects more back on people's own popular memory of the past, which is not quite the same thing as sort of what actually happened in that moment in the past. But certainly there are creative ways of doing that. What we don't have, for instance, in Colombia, say we have in the U.S. on our perfect source is there's not a single slave narrative of Colombia. Those of you who maybe studied the U.S. slavery, there's literally hundreds, actually thousands of slave narratives. There's not a single one in Colombia, and so we don't have certain options we don't have there to use. All right. Well, thank you very much. I very much appreciate your attention.